The courtroom lights were cooler than I expected, flat, almost blue, bleaching the wood to a pale sheen. Papers, shuffled heels clicked across terrazzo, and the whisper of 100 breaths braided into one low tide. When I stepped through the side door with the prosecution, my mother's head, tilted lips pressed into what looked like a smile, until I realized it was a laugh she was swallowing. My father didn't bother to hide his reaction. He shook his head once slow as a judge's gavel, as if correcting an unruly thought. I kept my eyes on the polished table edge and set my file down the way you lay a palm on a quiet animal. When the judge asked us to identify ourselves for the record, the room scraped into silence. I stood turned just enough for the gallery to see me and said my name. A chair creaked, a pen dropped, and somewhere behind my father, Judge Harold Williams went pale and whispered, "Dear God, is that really him?" Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter until the moment you stopped playing along, hit that like button, share this story with someone who'll understand, and make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. But to understand how that room learned my name, you need to know the house that taught me silence. I grew up in Mapleton, a town that smelled of wet leaves in October and hot blacktop in August. Our house sat behind a white gate and a line of sugar maples that turned the driveway into a gold tunnel every fall. Inside, the dining room had an oak table big enough to seat 12, though most nights it held 4 plates and a centerpiece of white lilies my mother refreshed like clockwork. By the window, my father kept a brass telescope he rarely used, trained toward a horizon he already owned. Richard Lawson shook hands like he owned the handshake. He built shopping centers where corn once stood and turned a sleepy county into a portfolio. People said he brought jobs and light. At charity galas, men pressed in close to hear his stories, women leaned in to offer introductions, and my mother floated beside him like a silver bell. Elizabeth Lawson, the name you wanted on your invitation if you were raising money for anything. I learned early that urgency had a dress code, and generosity could be photographed. At that oak table, I learned something else. If Adam made a joke, my mother's laugh came quick and soft, the kind that lands on your sleeve and stays there. If I brought home a report card with all A's and 1 B+ in advanced chemistry, her smile stiffened at the edges. "Why not an A?" she would ask, not unkindly, just efficiently. Adam was 4 years older and sat as straight as the crystal in the cabinet. Captain of the debate team valedictorian Princeton before Thanksgiving of his senior year. The town called him Future. People called me pretty, which sounded like a compliment until I learned what they meant was decorative. The summer I turned 13, I went looking for a stapler and found a door inside a drawer. My father's study smelled like leather and paper and that lemon oil my mother favored. I pressed the heel of my palm against the side panel and felt the click. The shallow compartment held a neat stack of envelopes with names I knew from Christmas parties and ribbon cuttings, each one scribbled with amounts and dates. Judge Harold Williams among them, and a glossy photo of my father and the mayor drinking at a hunting lodge I'd never seen. The men were smiling the way men smile when they think the woods keep secrets. I was still reading the caption on the back of one photo when the light in the room changed. My father was standing in the doorway. He said my full name the way a judge says a case number. Beatrice. The stapler I'd come to borrow felt heavy in my hand. He took the photo from me, slid it back into its sleeve, and shut the hidden panel with 2 fingers. "This is adult business," he said, voice even, eyes iron. "You'll forget what you saw." I nodded because I had learned that nodding was the first step toward surviving a conversation. I didn't forget. The stapler went missing again a week later. I never opened that drawer. High school moved like an assembly line, homecoming, prom, graduation. But nothing in me felt assembled. I liked rules best when they were written on paper. I liked patterns, the quiet kind You only notice if you're looking at the ledger instead of the parade. Where other girls collected magazine cutouts of dresses, I ripped out articles about whistleblowers and prosecutors who dug into corners nobody wanted swept. Heroes for me looked like court transcripts and a woman in a plain suit standing when everyone else chose to sit. The first real breath I took was 3 hours from Mapleton at a state university where no one connected my last name to a set of keys. I remember the first night in that tiny dorm room, the hum of the old radiator, the stain on the ceiling that looked like a dog's ear, the freedom of a closed door that didn't require me to be charming. I chose criminal justice because I wanted to understand the skeleton of the system, not the costume. My mother wrinkled her nose on the phone and said business like it was a life preserver. I told her I could swim. Professor James Sullivan had a voice like gravel and a way of listening that made you measure your words. He'd been a federal prosecutor and kept his old briefcase as if it were a dog that might bite someone else if you put it down. Most kids are here because they've watched too much television, he told me after a midterm tapping my paper with a thumbnail. You've got a different engine. He didn't ask about Mapleton or the house with the lilies. He asked about the difference between suspicion and proof. After graduation, my father had a plan for me summer internship at a law firm run by a friend, then a comfortable glide into the family's legal department. He said, legacy, the way some men say, grace. I said thank you and took an entry-level job at Thompson Investigative Services, where the fluorescent lights hummed, the coffee was bad, and you learned that truth doesn't wear evening clothes. I shared a fourth-floor walk-up with 2 other women and ate noodles from a cup at midnight while spreadsheets glowed like little constellations. It wasn't glamorous. It was mine. The first time I met Ryan Mitchell, he arrived with a laptop under one arm and a paper bag full of breakfast sandwiches he claimed were going to save morale. He was a forensic accountant who could follow a dollar through a hurricane and make a joke while doing it. We worked a mess of an insurance fraud scheme together. The sort of case that makes your eyes ache, and then if you're patient, rewards you with one clean thread. We pulled it, and a small city of lies came down. The local FBI field office took notice. Ryan brought me a cupcake and said I had a gift for finding shape in static. I laughed and told him I just liked quiet puzzles. There's a particular stillness that comes over a room when a new case unfolds on your screen. No music, no conversation, just the hum of your own concentration. 2 years into my bureau posting, that hush carried something colder. Operation Silverback was a wide net thrown over a group of legitimate businesses suspected of laundering money through the patient shuffle of paperwork. We were 3 weeks into crawling through the numbers when a transfer record stopped me mid-sip. Lawson Holdings. The name tucked into a corner of my childhood, like a sturdy piece of furniture, had moved $2 million through offshore accounts before landing in the personal account of Judge Harold Williams. Date stamps lined up with a development approval back home, so precisely, it felt like a ruler had been laid across the calendar. I leaned back, pressing the heel of my hand to my collarbone, listening to the heat click in the baseboard. In an instant, 13-year-old me was standing in that lemon-scented study with a photo in one hand and a father closing a panel with the other. It would have been easy, so easy, to copy the file label, "It miscellaneous," and let the tide pull it under. It would have been safer, too. If righteousness were a feeling, it would not have felt like this. It felt like a small ache behind the eyes and a quiet that reached all the way to my throat. I called Adam from the office phone as the sun slid down the glass of a building across the street. He sounded genuinely happy to hear my voice. That almost undid me. I asked him a question I already knew the shape of. Do you ever see anything at work that isn't right? The silence told me more than words would. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, like he was stepping around a loose board. Some questions are better left unasked, especially in this family. Is that a warning? I asked, It's advice, he said. Walk away. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. The office smelled like burnt coffee. Across the aisle, a junior analyst laughed at something on her phone. In the window's reflection, my posture looked like my mother's shoulders back, chin lifted. The difference was in my hands. They didn't tremble. Professor Sullivan's words floated back with the steadiness of a metronome. The hardest truths to face are the ones closest to home. The greatest courage is pursuing justice, no matter where it leads. I closed my eyes and pictured the oak table, the lilies, the telescope pointed at a horizon that didn't need watching. Then I pictured a ledger, clean and simple numbers, doing what numbers always do, telling the truth if you let them. I created a new folder on the secure server and gave it a name that would mean nothing to anyone else. I didn't think about Thanksgiving or the carols my mother played too loud every December. I didn't think about what a last name can do in a small town. I thought about a judge's pale face and a child's hands holding a photo that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Outside the office window, dusk folded neatly into the street's headlights, stitching a quiet seam along the avenue. I saved the first document, then another, then opened a blank page for notes, because every beginning deserves a witness. Somewhere in Mapleton, my mother would be fluffing lilies and checking the porch light. Somewhere closer, a phone would start ringing in a room I could not see. I hit encrypt, closed the laptop, and smoothed the wrinkles from my sleeve. The hum of the building felt louder in the sudden quiet. And for a moment, I could hear my father's voice, measured, patient, absolutely certain that rules were for other people. I stood, reached for my coat, and felt the small weight of choice settle in my chest like a stone worn smooth by water. When I stepped into the hallway, a draft slipped under the office door and lifted the edge of a memo on my desk. It fluttered once, then stilled. I pulled the door shut behind me and watched the latch catch. On the other side of the glass, my reflection held my gaze, chin lifted, shoulders square, eyes steady. By morning, the numbers would wait where I left them. By night, I would learn what it costs to keep them safe. The building was empty when I came back the next morning. The hum of the fluorescent lights carried down the hallway like a warning. I poured myself a cup of burnt coffee that had sat too long on the warmer and opened my laptop. The folder I'd created the night before blinked in the corner of my screen, its small blue icon holding everything I wasn't ready to face. Outside, rain gathered in the window seams and ran down in crooked lines, the kind that blur the world behind them. For weeks I moved between my assigned cases and the one that lived in my head. Every document I touched for Operation Silverback led back to the same name, the same trail of signatures that reeked of privilege. I worked in silence, careful, methodical, a ghost at my own desk. When coworkers laughed in the break room, I smiled, nodded, and went back to the numbers. I had learned early that invisibility could be a kind of protection. When I finally gathered the courage to bring what I had to my supervisor, I rehearsed the words in my car. I told myself I would speak like an investigator, not a daughter. Agent Clark was a man with 30 years in the bureau, steady and unreadable. His office lined with framed commendations. He listened as I laid out my findings, flipping through pages without looking at me. When I finished, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "This is interesting," he said slowly, "but you're seeing patterns that may not be there." I pointed to the matching dates, the offshore accounts, the rulings that followed each transfer. "Sir, these are not coincidences." He closed the folder, careful not to meet my eyes. "Beatrice correlation isn't proof. I'd suggest you leave this one alone until we have more to go on." His tone was calm, but final. I walked out of his office with my heart in my throat. The hallway seemed longer than before. Something about his dismissal didn't feel like caution, it felt like warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, thinking of the hunting lodge photo I had once held in my hands. The next morning, I started over. If the official channels wouldn't touch the truth, I would follow it myself. I began documenting quietly, using only data I was cleared to access. At first, I thought I was being cautious. Later, I realized I was being watched. The first note appeared under my apartment door, folded twice, no envelope. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. Some stones are better left unturned. I told myself it was nothing, a warning sent to the wrong address, a prank. But a week later, another note waited on my windshield. Family matters should stay in the family. When I showed the notes to Ryan, his easy smile faltered. "B, whatever this is, you need to stop," he said, voice low. "It's not worth it. We could request a transfer, go somewhere else, start over." I wanted to tell him what I was really doing, to unload the storm that had built inside me. But everything about my job, everything about the danger, taught me to compartmentalize. "It's fine," I said. "Just a complicated case." He studied me for a long time. "You've been distant for weeks. You don't eat. You barely sleep. I don't know what you're chasing, but it's eating you alive." He wasn't wrong. My desk at home had become a small island of paper photographs and highlighted lines of text. The farther I followed the money, the more I saw my father's shadow. His companies, his partners, even names from Mapleton's old social pages. Every night, I told myself I would stop, and every morning I found another connection. Then one evening, I came home to find Ryan waiting with takeout and a bottle of wine. He smiled, but there was tension in it. "No more work tonight," he said, opening the containers. "We need to breathe a little." I tried to join him, but my mind stayed on the evidence locked in my drawer. After dinner, I excused myself to check an email I hadn't received. In the small lamp glow of my office, something caught the light, a pinprick glint under the lampshade. I leaned closer. The object was the size of a button, almost invisible. A microphone. My hand went cold. I checked the drawer where I kept my files. Everything had been shifted, barely noticeable, but not the way I'd left it. I walked back to the living room, the floor steady beneath my feet, though I felt nothing steady inside. "How long have you been spying on me?" Ryan froze with a dish towel in his hands. The silence stretched between us until he lowered his head. "B, please." "How long since the beginning?" he said quietly. The room seemed to tilt. "The beginning." He nodded, words tumbling out in a rush. "Your father hired me before we met. He wanted someone to look after you, to make sure you didn't dig into things that could hurt the family. He thought if you trusted me, I could keep you safe." "Safe," I said, my voice hollow. "You mean silent." "I fell in love with you," he said, stepping closer. "That part wasn't supposed to happen. I tried to protect you, B. When he wanted to block your FBI application, I stopped him. When he got wind of what you were looking into, I told him you were chasing the wrong lead. 3 years of shared mornings of laughter of a man who seemed to understand me more than anyone ever had, every bit of it folded into a lie. I told him to leave. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. When the door shut behind him, the quiet pressed in. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, and let the truth unravel. My family, my mentor, the man I loved, each thread tied back to the same name. By dawn, I had stopped shaking. I gathered every drive, every note, and packed a small overnight bag. Then I called in sick, something I had never done before. I cleared my computer of personal files, copied the evidence to encrypted drives, and wiped the rest. I drove without music, just the sound of tires on wet pavement. At a gas station outside Albany, I used a payphone to dial a number I had memorized years earlier, but never once called. "This is Special Agent Beatrice Lawson," I said. "I need to speak with U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez. It's urgent." Martinez was known in every bureau office, sharp, incorruptible, unwilling to bend. She agreed to meet me that afternoon, no questions asked. By the time I reached Manhattan, the clouds had thinned to streaks of gray. The federal building loomed ahead, quiet and solid, its stones soaked darker by the rain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and metal polish. Martinez met me in a small conference room with 2 sealed windows and a clock that ticked too loudly. She listened without interrupting as I explained what I had found. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You did the right thing. But from here on, we move carefully. You can't go back to your apartment. You can't trust your office." The words should have scared me more than they did. Instead, I felt a strange calm. Someone finally understood. Martinez arranged a safe house through a contact in Connecticut. Before I left, she said, "Truth has a cost, Agent Lawson. Make sure you're ready to pay it." I didn't answer. Some debts you don't choose. The safe house sat at the edge of a small town near the coast, a white clapboard cottage with a single rocking chair on the porch and woods at the back that smelled of rain and pine. Professor Sullivan met me there the next day. Retirement had softened his walk, but not his eyes. When I opened the door, he looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I always knew you'd come to a crossroads like this," he said. "I just hoped it wouldn't be so close to home." Inside, we spread files across the kitchen table, the same way we used to spread case studies in his old classroom. "You were right," I told him. "The system I trusted isn't clean." He nodded, unflinching. "Then we make it cleaner." Days bled into weeks. Martinez's small team began verifying each piece of my evidence, cross-checking records, freezing accounts, taking quiet statements from officials who didn't yet know how much we knew. I spent my nights writing in a plain spiral notebook Sullivan gave me. At first, the pages filled with facts. Then, when sleep wouldn't come, I started writing memories, the maples, the lilies, the way my father's office smelled of cedar. Writing gave the anger somewhere to go. On quiet afternoons, I walked the back road behind the house, gravel crunching beneath my shoes, and tried to remember who I was before the name Lawson meant corruption. Some days I didn't find her. Other days, I caught glimpses, small things like the steadiness of my own breath or the way sunlight filtered through wet branches. I learned to breathe through the fear, to hold steady in the silence. The deeper we went, the more dangerous it became. Martinez's voice on the phone stayed calm but clipped. "We're close," she'd say. "Stay where you are. No contact with anyone outside this circle." Each day brought a little more distance from the person I'd been: a daughter, a partner, an agent who believed in systems. What remained was something quieter, sharper. A witness. One evening, Sullivan knocked on my door holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You know," he said, setting them down, "integrity doesn't end when people stop believing in it. It just gets heavier to carry." I smiled for the first time in weeks. Then I guess I'd better get stronger. That night, I stood on the porch and listened to the wind move through the trees. Somewhere out there, my father was still calling himself a good man. Somewhere, the wheels were already turning toward the day I would face him again. The thought didn't scare me. It steadied me. Inside, the clock in the kitchen clicked once, marking the hour. I turned off the light and watched the window go dark, knowing the next time I saw my family, it would not be as their daughter, but as their witness. The days that followed, blurred together, marked only by the sound of rain on the porch roof and the steady tick of the kitchen clock. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee in silence, and watched the mist roll through the trees beyond the safe house. The air always smelled of wet pine and salt from the distant coast. In those early hours, I felt both invisible and alive, as if the world had been stripped down to its simplest form, truth and breath. Professor Sullivan drove up from town twice a week, his old sedan wheezing up the gravel drive. We worked at the kitchen table surrounded by files, his handwriting looping across yellow pads, while I organized timelines. "You've built something solid here. he said one afternoon, flipping through my notes. The story's airtight, but the people in it, they'll fight like cornered animals. I nodded, tracing a finger along the edges of a photograph that showed my father beside Judge Williams. I'm not afraid of the fight, I said quietly. I'm afraid of what it will cost. Sullivan studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. Courage isn't about not fearing the cost. It's about knowing you'll pay it and walking forward anyway. It was the kind of thing he said without drama, just truth resting on the table between us. I wrote his words in the margin of my notebook and underlined them twice. By the end of that month, Sarah Martinez's team had built the framework of the case. I traveled to Manhattan under heavy security riding in the back of a government car with the windows tinted so dark the city passed like a shadow. We met in a small office on the 12th floor of the federal building. The room smelled faintly of dust and ink, the blinds half drawn against the afternoon glare. Martinez was direct. We're moving into the final stage. Every wire transfer, every shell company, every signature, your father's fingerprints are on all of it. She tapped the folder in front of her. But we can't afford leaks. No communication with anyone connected to the Bureau's local field office. Her confidence steadied me. I had expected to feel fear hearing her words. Instead, I felt relief. For the first time in years, the truth wasn't just mine to carry. Still, when night fell and the city lights flickered through the hotel curtains, the loneliness returned. I found myself scrolling through old photos I should have deleted long ago. My mother arranging flowers at the dining table. Adam laughing at something just off camera. My father standing in his study, confident and untouchable. The people in those photos were ghosts now preserved in a world where loyalty had meant silence. 2 weeks later, Sullivan called from the university. Your mother's trying to reach you, he said. She left a message at my office. Says it's urgent. I hesitated. Did she sound afraid? She sounded desperate, he replied. There's a difference. After hours of thought, I agreed to meet her, but only on my terms. A public place, no warning of the location, and she had to come alone. We settled on a small cafe in New Haven. I arrived early, sitting by the window where I could see both doors. My coffee went cold before she walked in. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman who used to glide through charity galas now moved with careful uncertainty. Her makeup was too heavy, trying to disguise the sleeplessness beneath her eyes. When she saw me, her expression softened into something almost maternal. Beatrice, she said, reaching for my hand. I kept mine folded around the cup. Why are you here, Mother? She sighed and glanced around, lowering her voice. Your father knows. About the investigation. About you. I assumed he would, I said. She leaned closer, her perfume faint but familiar. You don't understand what he's capable of. He's angry. He feels betrayed. Betrayed, I repeated. He built an empire on betrayal. Her lips trembled before she regained composure. He's still your father. He can fix this. You just need to come home before this goes too far. I'm not the one who needs fixing. Her eyes filled, but the tears seemed as rehearsed as her charity speeches. If you do this, you'll destroy everything our family built. I held her gaze. He destroyed it the day he decided his power mattered more than people. Something shifted in her expression. Fear, then resignation. She stood, gathering her purse. He knows the indictments are coming, she said. He's prepared. Are you? When she left, the bell above the door chimed softly. I sat for a long time after staring at the empty chair across from me. The coffee had gone cold, but the fear beneath her words hadn't. Back at the safe house, I told Sullivan about the meeting. He listened quietly, then said, You realize she was warning you. I know, and you're still moving forward. I met his eyes. There's no other way. The following week stretched taut with waiting. I exercised every morning until the air burned in my lungs, then reviewed files until the words blurred. Sleep came in fragments, dreams filled with half-seen faces, and the sound of my father's voice echoing down long hallways. Martinez called to confirm what I already sensed: the grand jury had finished deliberations. Indictments were ready. The arrests will happen at dawn, she said. Your father will be processed at 2 p.m. in Manhattan. As lead investigator, your presence is required. The night before, I barely slept. I laid out my suit, pressed each crease, and pinned my hair back the way bureau protocol required. The ritual steadied my hands. When morning came, I watched the first light spread over the water beyond the trees, then turned away from the window. Whatever happened next, I would face it head on. By the time I reached the courthouse, news vans crowded the steps. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing like heat lightning. Martinez led me through a side entrance reserved for federal staff. The corridors were cooler inside, lined with marble that echoed every step. My pulse matched the rhythm of my heels. In a small antechamber, the prosecution team waited. Someone handed me a folder, another passed a bottle of water I didn't touch. Martinez turned to me before we entered. You don't have to be there, Beatrice. Given who's on that list, no one would blame you for stepping back. I shook my head. I need to see it through. She studied me for a beat, then nodded. Then keep your composure. Don't engage no matter what happens. When the doors opened, the noise of the crowd rolled in a low hum of expectation. I walked beside her to the front table. My steps measured, my focus fixed on the bench. The defendants filed in a few minutes later. My father led the line, immaculate in a charcoal suit, my mother close behind. Her eyes found me, first flicking with disbelief, then accusation. My father didn't look at me until the judge entered the room. When the clerk asked the prosecution to identify themselves, Martinez spoke first, clear and calm. Then it was my turn. I stood turned slightly and said, Special Agent Beatrice Lawson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, lead investigator. The reaction was instant, a gasp from the gallery, my mother's quick exhale, my father's slow shake of the head. Judge Williams paled, gripping the armrest, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His whisper carried across the silence. Dear God. Is that really him? Reporters rustled behind us, trying to make sense of the scene. The judge presiding over the arraignment called for order, her gavel striking once, sharp as glass. As the charges were read, conspiracy, bribery, fraud, obstruction, the words echoed like distant thunder. My father's attorney stood beside him, calm and polished, as if the entire proceeding were a negotiation over property instead of decades of corruption. When asked for his plea, my father's voice carried through the room. Not guilty. Your Honor. He looked at me then, a small, deliberate glance, his expression unreadable. For years, that gaze had dictated my life. Now, it was just a measure of distance between who I had been and who I'd become. The rest of the arraignment passed in fragments, paperwork, shuffled bail arguments traded like rehearsed lines. I focused on the table in front of me, on the steady sound of Martinez's voice. When the judge finally set bail at $10 million and adjourned, the room stirred back to life. My mother approached, despite the bailiff's warning, her voice sharp with anger. Are you satisfied, Beatrice? You've destroyed your father's name. You've destroyed us. Before I could answer, Martinez stepped in, her tone quiet but firm. Mrs. Lawson, all communication will go through official channels. My mother's eyes lingered on me, her voice a low hiss. You're not a daughter anymore. Remember that. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. When we left the courtroom, the air outside was heavy with summer heat. Cameras flashed again, the crowd pressing against the barriers. I kept my head down as agents guided us to a side exit. Once inside the government car, I exhaled for the first time all day. Martinez glanced at me from the passenger seat. "You did well," she said softly. "The hardest part's behind you." But we both knew the trial was only beginning. As the city slipped by outside the window, I felt a strange stillness settle in my chest. For months, I had lived divided agent and daughter, truth and blood. Now the lines were drawn. I was no longer hiding in shadows. I was standing in the light no matter how harsh it burned. The car turned north toward the bureau offices. The sky above Manhattan was the color of iron, thick with the promise of rain. I watched it darken and thought of the safe house, the woods, the quiet mornings that had given me strength. Soon the headlines would come. The trial, the scrutiny, the isolation. But for that brief moment, I allowed myself one deep breath of clear air, steady and full. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft, low, and final. The weeks that followed the arraignment passed like long stretches of gray water, smooth on the surface, turbulent underneath. Every morning, I woke before sunrise, made a single cup of coffee, and stood at my apartment window, watching the city begin its slow stir. Even then, the world outside felt foreign. My father's face appeared on every television screen, his name threaded through headlines that read like variations of a single sentence. Prominent developer charged in statewide corruption case. Reporters camped outside my building. Former colleagues avoided eye contact in the elevator. I learned to keep the curtains drawn. The bureau had placed me on administrative leave for my safety, but that word safety had lost its meaning. Every knock at the door made me tense. Every phone call from an unknown number set my pulse racing. Martinez stayed in contact, always calm, always composed. She called every few days with updates about motions and hearings. "They'll try to paint you as vindictive," she said, "a daughter with a grudge against her father. Be prepared for that." I expected worse, I told her. "You might still get it," she replied. She was right. My father's lawyers filed motion after motion accusing the Bureau of Bias, claiming evidence tampering, suggesting that I had manufactured documents to settle some private score. None of it stuck, but each headline cut another thread in the life I had known. I began therapy again, this time with someone Martinez recommended, a quiet woman named Dr. Everett who kept a metronome ticking softly on her desk during sessions. "You've experienced what we call moral injury," she explained one afternoon. "You acted in line with your values, but those actions fractured your identity. The world sees you as two people, daughter and accuser, and you're trying to live as both." Her words settled like dust in the air, fine but unavoidable. I realized that for the first time in my life, I couldn't be anyone's version of Beatrice Lawson. Not my mother's, not my father's, not even the Bureau's. The trial date was set 11 months after the arraignment. The courthouse was sealed from the public on opening day, though news cameras lined the street outside like sentinels. I walked past them surrounded by U.S. Marshals, the sound of my heels muted by the rain-soaked steps. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of polished stone and wet wool coats. In the courtroom, my father sat at the defense table, his posture immaculate. My mother, wrapped in a dark shawl, sat directly behind him. When she saw me enter, she looked away. I felt the faint tremor of anger beneath my ribs, not because she had chosen him, but because I had once believed she wouldn't. The trial began with financial records, rows of transactions displayed on a screen, each line a piece of a story he couldn't control. Martinez led the prosecution with measured precision, her voice calm, factual. There was no flourish, no anger, just the slow unraveling of decades of deceit. When she called me to the stand, I took a steadying breath and walked to the witness chair. My oath sounded smaller than I expected, but it steadied me. She started with the basics, my position, my responsibilities, the chain of evidence. Then came the questions about family. Did your father know of your employment with the Bureau? Yes. Did he attempt to influence your work? A pause. Indirectly? Yes. Through others? And did you uncover evidence linking his companies to a network of bribes and money laundering? Yes, I said, and my voice didn't waver. From the defense table, I could feel my father's eyes on me, cold, assessing, familiar. When cross-examination came, his attorney was everything I expected. Charming, articulate, deceptively polite. He began softly asking about my education, my career, the pride my family once felt. Then he pivoted. Agent Lawson, would it be fair to say you and your father had a strained relationship before this investigation? I suppose that depends on your definition of strained. He smiled thinly. You left home at 18 against his wishes, correct? I left because I needed to. Because you felt unseen, unappreciated. I hesitated, realizing the trap. Because I wanted to build a life based on truth. He nodded, as if indulging a child. And isn't it true that you once said in a conversation with a colleague that your father's influence could buy anything? I looked him in the eye. Yes, that's exactly why I couldn't stay silent. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. My father's lawyer glanced at the jury, hoping to plant the seed of rebellion rather than duty. I kept my gaze steady, my pulse loud in my ears. The questioning stretched for hours. When it ended, I stepped down from the stand with legs that felt like stone. Martinez gave me a small nod as I passed. No smile, just respect. That was enough. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Witnesses came and went, some defiant, some trembling. 2 of the smaller defendants accepted plea deals and testified, describing the cash deliveries, the offshore accounts, the dinners where deals were sealed, with laughter and envelopes. Every detail fit the pattern we'd drawn. My father's defense leaned on reputation and image. Decades of charity work jobs created taxes paid. His attorney described him as a man who played hard in a system already bent. The words hung heavy in the air, like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. I learned to sit still through the whispers, to keep my breathing even when my name was mentioned in ways that twisted truth into spectacle. Some nights, I couldn't sleep. I'd walk the empty streets near my apartment, the city humming softly around me, and wonder what kind of person I would be when this ended. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. The jury was out less than 2 days. I sat beside Martinez at the front table, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles ached. The foreperson stood unfolding the sheet of paper with deliberate calm. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of bribery, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. The words continued steady and final. My father's expression didn't change until the very end. When the last verdict was read, he turned to me just for a moment, and I saw no remorse, only the wounded pride of a man who still believed himself untouchable. My mother wept silently into a handkerchief. I felt nothing, no triumph, no victory, only the hollow quiet of inevitability. After the judge dismissed the court, I waited until the room emptied. The air felt heavy, thick with something unfinished. As U.S. Marshals led the defendants away, my father paused. The faintest flicker of recognition crossed his face like he might speak. Instead, he straightened his jacket and walked on. Outside, The late afternoon light fell in golden streaks across the courthouse steps. Reporters pressed forward, shouting questions. I said nothing. Martinez's hand brushed my arm, wordless support, and together we walked through the noise toward the waiting car. In the days that followed, the world reacted. Some called me a hero, others a traitor. Former friends avoided my messages. Strangers sent letters, some grateful, some hateful. I stopped reading them. My mother left the country within weeks, retreating to the house in Switzerland they had kept for years. Adam sent a brief note through secure mail. I'm proud of you. I wish I'd been stronger. When the sentencing came, I watched from a private room. 20 years for my father. 15 for Judge Williams. The rest would serve smaller terms. The sentences felt like numbers carved into water, measured necessary but still transient. Justice, I realized, was rarely the same thing as peace. That night, I returned to my apartment and opened the balcony door. The city spread beneath me, lights flickering like quiet stars. Somewhere people were laughing, living ordinary lives untouched by courtrooms or corruption. I envied them, but I also understood something I hadn't before I had chosen a path that didn't allow for simplicity. For the first time in months, I let myself cry, not from sorrow, but from release. The sound was small against the noise of the city, but it felt like truth finding its way out. When I finally went inside, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a new notebook. The first page was blank. I wrote a single line across the top. What comes after justice? I didn't know the answer yet, but the act of writing it down felt like a beginning. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, fading into the night. The morning after the sentencing, the city felt strangely hushed. The storm that had hovered for days finally broke overnight, washing the streets clean and leaving puddles that reflected thin strips of sky. I opened the balcony door and stepped outside barefoot. The air smelled faintly of rain and concrete dust. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for the next blow to fall. Below me, traffic moved in slow rhythm. Taxis, delivery vans, the usual pulse of people trying to get somewhere. I realized how much of life had continued while mine stood still, circling courtrooms and evidence files. Justice had a sound I hadn't expected. It wasn't a gavel or a headline. It was quiet, just breath moving through an open window. That afternoon, I met with Martinez in her office one last time. The blinds were half-drawn sunlight striping across her desk. You can take your time, she said, handing me a folder of final reports. The Bureau's reinstatement offer stands. New division, new start. I closed the folder without reading. Not yet, I said. I need to learn how to live without chasing something. Martinez studied me for a long moment before nodding. Then build something worth chasing when you're ready. Her words carried no pressure, just understanding. When I left her office, she clasped my hand, a small gesture, but one that felt like passing a torch. Back at the apartment, I packed slowly. The space looked smaller than I remembered, every surface holding a trace of the person I used to be. I donated most of what I owned and shipped the rest to a storage unit. By sunset, the walls were bare except for the faint square where a picture frame had once hung. I stood there for a while, fingertips tracing the outline, thinking about how absence can feel like release. 2 months later, I moved to Boston. A quiet neighborhood near the harbor brick sidewalks and a coffee shop that knew my order by heart within a week. I rented a modest apartment with creaky floors and sunlight that poured across the kitchen every morning. The first night, I slept without locks on the windows, the breeze lifting the curtains like breath. At first, my days were simple. Long walks by the water, therapy sessions with Dr. Everett every Tuesday morning, volunteering at a legal aid clinic twice a week. There, among worn-out chairs and the faint smell of old paper, I met people who reminded me why I'd started down this path. Ordinary men and women who had been dismissed, silenced, or ignored. Helping them didn't heal everything, but it steadied the ground beneath me. 6 months after the trial ended, I opened an email from Adam. It was brief, almost hesitant. "I'm living in Denver now. Left the company. Started consulting work. Still learning what honesty feels like. I hope you're well. I'd like to see you someday." I read it 3 times before answering. "I'm in Boston. There's a small cafe by the harbor. Come when you can." He arrived a month later on a gray afternoon. We sat by the window, both unsure how to begin. He looked older, the polished confidence of our father replaced by something gentler. "You were right," he said finally, eyes lowered to his coffee. "I just didn't want it to be true." I reached across the table not to forgive, but to acknowledge. We all wanted to believe he was better than he was. Adam nodded. "I'm sorry for warning you away back then. You don't have to explain," I said. We both survived the same storm in different ways. That conversation didn't erase the past, but it loosened its grip. Before we parted, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a single photograph of us, as children, sitting on the lawn behind our old house. The corners were bent, the colors fading, but the moment was intact. "Keep it," he said. "It's the only picture where we both look free." Over the following year, I built something I hadn't expected, a life that was quiet but whole. With Professor Sullivan's encouragement, I founded a nonprofit called the Accountability Project. We offered legal guidance, security training, and emotional support to whistleblowers, people standing on the same ledge I once stood on. The first client arrived through word of mouth, then another, and soon we had a small team working out of a rented office overlooking the Charles River. Every case carried echoes of my own, but I approached them differently now. Not as a rescuer, but as someone holding space for courage. Dr. Everett once told me that healing isn't a finish line. It's maintenance, she said, smiling softly. Like tending a garden. Some seasons you just keep things alive. I think she was right. There are still nights when I wake at 3 a.m., heart pounding, convinced I'm back in that courtroom. But when I step outside and hear the harbor wind, the panic fades. The world feels wide again. Letters from my mother come twice a year. Short, careful paragraphs written on fine stationery. She never mentions the trial, only weather and small talk, the garden, a new acquaintance in Switzerland, an old recipe she rediscovered. I respond politely, sometimes not at all. The distance feels honest, the silence merciful. As for my father, I hear about him only through legal updates. His appeal was denied. He's serving his sentence quietly, an old man surrounded by the echo of his own empire. I no longer wish him harm or redemption. Some people simply stay where they chose to stand. There are moments, though, when I think of him not as the man in court, but as the father who once held the back of my bike until I could balance on my own. That memory isn't forgiveness. It's a reminder that even those who harm us are made of more than their worst acts. I keep that memory not to justify him, but to remind myself I came from both truth and shadow, and I chose the brighter path. Last spring, Adam visited again, this time with his fiancée, a woman named Claire, who radiated calm. We spent a weekend exploring the harbor, laughing more than I expected. On the last night, he lifted his glass and said, "To building new names for ourselves." I smiled and touched mine gently against his. "To peace," I said. It wasn't a toast to forgetting, but to finally breathing without weight. When summer came, I moved into a small townhouse near Beacon Hill. The place has a narrow staircase and a window seat that overlooks a sycamore tree. I planted lavender in the front garden and painted the kitchen a soft shade of green. Most mornings, I sit by the window with coffee and watch people walking their dogs, children racing scooters down the sidewalk. Ordinary life, the kind I once thought I'd lost forever, has a rhythm again. Sometimes I visit the pier at sunset where the sky turns to copper and the air smells of salt and wood. I bring my notebook, the same one I started the night of the verdict. Its pages are nearly full now. Observations, fragments of cases, the occasional line of gratitude. On the last page, I wrote something simple. Peace doesn't mean silence. It means being able to hear yourself think again. Standing there, watching the last light fade across the water, I finally understand that justice was never about punishment alone. It was about reclaiming truth and learning to live without hiding from it. The years have softened me in ways I didn't expect. I laugh more easily. I cry less from fear and more from beauty. A stranger holding a door, a song played by a street violinist that reminds me how far I've come. Every scar has its echo, but they hum quietly now, like a distant train fading into night. As evening settles, I close the notebook, slip it into my bag, and head home along the brick path lit by warm streetlights. My reflection follows in the shop windows, steady, composed, a woman no longer running from her name. Inside the doorway of my townhouse, the air smells faintly of lavender. I pause there, hand on the knob, listening to the faint city hum. Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive like a miracle. It grows in small moments, the sound of rain on glass, a letter unopened, a brother's quiet apology. It's the slow decision to stay gentle in a world that once demanded armor. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever found your own kind of peace after walking through chaos, I'd love to hear how you did it. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and finding light when the world goes dark. Because sometimes the hardest part of justice isn't the fight. It's learning how to live once you've won.